Bonjour à tous. Je te remercie Aïda pour cette introduction.
Good morning to all. Thank you, Aida, for this presentation. And thank you for organizing the symposium. It's brilliant to have put together so many experts. And I'm happy to present what I'm doing as a thesis.
L'insularité et l'aridité comme territoire d'apprentissage et modèle.
And I want to talk about Naplouse. Naplouse,
je le crois beaucoup avec les préoccupations de ce colloque.
Which is very much in line with the topics of this symposium. So Naplouse is in a Palestinian territory north of Jerusalem under Palestinian administration in a territory that is fragmented by Israel occupation. The city was created in a valley and has a legacy system of a legacy water system from the Roman time in the soil of the city. And that's why we called the presentation the potentials of hybridization within an ancient built system. And this is a tradition that is being lost, a problem that we all face. But here in Naplouse, we have a contradiction between tradition and modernity when they should be complementary to deal with shortages and demographic growth, knowing that it is a semi-arid climate, and it's in the subsoil of the city that we see what was available. And the Naplouse Water Department deals with or runs the water system. It's a very built, carefully designed system that is complex, that changed over time with the changes in techniques and resources. It's a unique system that is linked to the specificities of the environment there, with prospects that could lead to bringing together materials and systems. This case study goes well beyond the question of ownership and romanticism in traditional vernacular architecture, because the system in Naplouse is different from that, and we have to rethink architecture and systems in the long term or long run. Just to be clear, we will look at the chronology of the system, the water system. Initially, it was put in place in the Roman times, then developed in the Ottoman period, and then revamped early at the start of the 20th century. There are archaeological studies and surveys on the ground that started some 3 years ago. And with this, we will understand how the system runs today and what are the paradigms and how it works. But before we look at the territory, it's always interesting when you talk about water. Naplouse is on a mountain ridge. You have the coastal plains and the river plains. That's where you have strong hot winds that break against the mountains and provide a hot and dry season from May to October and a cold season the rest of the year. And it's the cold season that see rainfalls in the mount that you see here on the drawing. This mountain will then recharge its karstic aquifer, and from there we have about 50 water springs with different flows or yields, with a cycle of recharging and discharging that is fairly traditional for this type of system. And the springs are the outcome of climate and geology, and they provide water in the valley. Now, first time, it's by the springs that Alexander the Great and the Roman Empire built the water system, very ingenious system, in the foundations of the Roman city, with a primary network of aqueducts that harness the springs with connected wells to store large volumes of water to smooth out the deficit. If I start from the Roman system, we have to remember that there was a precedent, because there was a first aqueduct from well before, which was itself there was another aqueduct on the site of El Balata. To harness the springs, the Romans put in place a number of facilities, a chamber in Azaline, to go down inside the mountain and to collect water from the spring. You see there, and the aqueduct that is like an extension of the karst, with materials coming from the mountain itself, because they're built with limestones from there. There's another system that is inside the city, which is what we call a nympheum. If you've been to Rome or in other cities, this is fairly typical for springs. It's a cave with a spring, and it's where human beings celebrated the springs. So there's a cave just behind here. But today, this building is the way into the mountain for the Naples water department officials. And then the water was harnessed and sent into an aqueduct. So it was a double system with a bypass to provide water to a basin. And you have two buildings that are, in fact, ways into the subsoil of the mountain, and they're very well hidden. You have to ask the engineers to take you there. And you see with these drawings that Nablus was built all around that. Final system, the Dyn-Afna spring, which is the lowest in the valley, and it gets a lot of pressure from the aquifer. So there's a cistern or water tank, and with the clay soil that is used, the water will go through, seep through, and then go down into another water tank. Some of it has collapsed, but the main part remains and brings the water back to a large water tank, which is the main source of water for Naplouse. So this links the natural ground to the city of Naplouse with a simple use of gravitation. With time passing, the aqueducts were maintained, the springs renewed, and certains sébiles de la période ottomane superposent un petit peu les plans d'implantation, s'implantent le long du parcours de ces aqueducs, prolongeant le système en lui-même. Sibyl à l'échelle de l'habitat, qui est toujours une échelle were implemented there, on remarque également and you can see de ces liens à l'eau, that there are traces of the relationship to water within the walls. The water is essential to architecture, and these are traditional houses called urush. And there's a fantastic book on that, on a number of cities in Palestine. So the water is put into the walls. It shows the relationship to water, and you have water bearers that came to fill their tanks, and they were already present in the Roman times. First, material hybridation. It took an earthquake that destroyed most of the underground system of aqueducts. The municipality started with the British administration, the protectorate. They started archaeological digs and tried to modernize the system and integrate the cast iron pipes that you can see on the pictures here. And these pipes are still present today. So that was the first hybridization, and the system was renewed, but within the existing structure, within the limestones of the aqueducts. And it uses gravitation as the main force and kept that. There was a first distribution network that was set up with the first pump on the Lanasal source or spring. So you see the logic of gravitational abduction and the reservoirs that are integrated into the Ottoman dwellings, and the water bearers will slowly disappear because the municipality will distribute water instead. After the Anakba, which is the second crisis for Naplouse, that will force Palestinians to move. The city tripled its population within a year and welcomed over 50,000 internal refugees, which was massive. So, sudden demographic growth that led to a big crisis for the city. and the volume of water available from the springs was not sufficient for the whole population. And to meet the needs, the municipality decided to increase its storage facility and its distribution network, and it built 3 reservoirs or water tanks with a capacity of 500 cubic meters each. You see the water tanks in blue. One is at the top of the valley and sends water to the other water tanks, and then it's redistributed through the blue network or grid that you see. And you also have water towers to provide water to the different neighborhoods. This picture was taken in 2022, where you see water tanks on the roofs. It's very much part and parcel of the system and the daily management of water there. But the problem of the quantity of water available was not solved, and you had to wait another 30 years, 1978, for the system to increase its water volume. And they built a new well that extracted water from the underground water to end years of hydric stress. And because of the demographic growth that continued, the Nablus Water Department expanded its capacities for water storage and harnessing. But the system spread over time without with the existing sources, which represent 20% of the water consumption today. You have different pressure zones, 3 to 4 days in the winter, 5 to 6 days in the summer, and the users are very much part of the water management system, and it provides for a cycle of water, as you see here. So the system of water in Nablus is very much an example of what happened over 2,000 years. So it's a built system that changed over time, but it asks questions about our own traditional systems because they can be adapted to new climate conditions and new milieus or environments. These legacy structures are good for local governance. In 2002, Nablus was not impacted by the World Bank reform that promoted a private-public partnership with the Lyonnaise des Eaux, the French company, with a decentralized government at a national and regional level that would have excluded the city from local governance. But I'll stop here. The built system in Nablus shows the link between water and architecture, between water and human beings, which has changed over time. And that leads to a new paradigm to think about water management. Thank you.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to be
presenting a case study around our ancestral practices, millennial groundwater recharge. We're working on the Comsa, a territory here in southern Burgundy that is suffering both from severe summer drought with dried up rivers during the summer and sometimes rivers in space. It's a kind of a seasonal imbalance, a problem that's widespread in France today, linked to the fact that aquifers can't recharge, and so the territory can't retain the water in winter to use it in the summer. But so how to restore water to land to use it in the summer? Solutions are multiplying over the years with experimentations that are not always successful, such as Karachi forced rainwater retention on the left, or regenerative approach based on loci, such as the beaver dams, as mentioned in Baptiste Morisot, to restore water to the land. But we were asking, are there solutions that are developed in the past in order to for groundwater recharge artificially that we could usefully benefit from today, or draw an example from? Well, answer to that is yes. Look at all regions where the climate system, geology, geomorphology didn't allow for sufficient natural groundwater recharge. We find ingenious solutions in order to retain water and to save it in the earth, be it as here on the left along Oued, the Gestion system in Tunisia, or located in urban areas on the right in the well of Talo. That's in southern Iran. And today I'm going to present to you a particularly interesting and complex case of this type of practice, the submerged orchards in Gasmin, Iran. In fact, the Gasmin plain, as you can see on the map here, here it is delineated in the north by high mountain range and to the south by a desert, and is characterized by very low annual precipitation, long periods of drought, and small short winter rainy seasons in the spring. So there are no permanent rivers in this plain, but several waterways, temporary waterways, seasonal waterways that carry the mountain runoff to the down to the plain during the rainy season. But to meet the needs throughout the year, the inhabitants fully understand the need to leverage the limited mountain runoff and reserves of underground water that will be accessible pretty much throughout the year, and so restore as much water to the ground as possible. So very complex system of water between groundwater recharge and the reutilization of water stored in the aquifers downstream was put in place along the plain, as we see here on this schematic cutaway. The aim is to slow the water flow through the dams for the runoff, and then to separated into thousands of infiltration basins. These are basins that are actually orchard plots that are dug about 1.50 meter into the ground, into the earth, with a from varying between 700 and 7,000 square meters, and they can receive the mountain water runoff and thereby recharging the aquifers in the plain. And then with a set of underground galleries and channels, the water was carried along the surface to supply the dwellings and farmland further down. So the principles are simple. Slow the water flow and distribute it along large surface areas, recharge the groundwater, reutilizing the aquifers throughout the year. Now, this development system of water systems has shaped the landscape on the plain. We see a correlation between upstream and downstream of the plain. Upstream, a series of submerged orchards around urban areas, towns, villages, with a limited range of species that can support long periods of drought, whilst having pretty deep roots in order to capture the wetness in the ground. Traditionally, we find pistachio trees, almond trees, apricot trees, and vineyards. In fact, the area is known for being the first place where the Iranians grew pistachios 1,500 years ago. So here, these are all the dwellings and the orchards in the foothills. With the system, we've got a few kilometers of desert marked by the rain that come from Janat, shown here. And this is the water flow, and a second set of villages and farmland emerging around the outflow of the Kanat, with cereal or fruit crops requiring more regular irrigation. And on the city of Qazvin, the capital of Persia before Isfahan, we see on this photograph 1956 an intertwined sets of tens of thousands of these infiltration basins of orchard plots surrounding the town, forming a sort of a green belt around the urban area, delineating clearly the town from the surrounding desert in the plain. And to run the system, we have a sophisticated water management system. The rigorous sharing of the water from 5 rivers that supplied all the orchards, and cooperative management, participatory governance of the water system, which is a system moving upwards. Systems are managed in various sections. Firstly, a set of plots irrigated by the same water channel and maintained by gardeners and contained within a unit called a quarter or a district. Here in purple, we see it. It's clearly delineated in purple. And today, Today, there are about 160 quarters of districts of these villages, and then 4 or 5 adjacent districts benefit from the same waterway, the same water channel, with a second unit called FAND, F-A-N-D. It's a Persian word. I didn't find the equivalent in French or English. It's just a Persian word. It's really a combination of quarters district, second unit FAND. It's shown here in black, and the neighboring fans are supplied by river, so this water management system is a system of cooperation by the gardeners at varying scales. It's a group of plots up to quarters districts of FAND, as they're known, to the governance and sharing the river water. A governance system for water and monitoring system of the resources, as illustrated by Van der Shiva, described in their works. Shown here is the river water that enters each fand and then is divided into various channels to supply the various quarters districts and supplying each individual plot. A few photographs of these orchard basins filled with water, and I've given a quote of Jane Diolafoy, a French archaeologist who traveled in Persia between 1883 and 87. She went to Kazmin in 1881 and testifies, I quote, to a large belt of gardens surrounds the walls of Kazmin, and we moved quite close to them. We would have done so had an immense lake not forced us to go the long way round before reaching the outskirts. Singular surprise, I said, I never heard about salt lakes of Urmia and Shiraz. So what is this particular lake? You see the image that this system of irrigation conveys on the plain, and the 9th of May, we're still in the period of irrigation of the orchards, and you see probably the orchards filled with water like a lake around and that was quite striking. The water sharing system is based on a spatial temporal system resources. All the orchards were determined on the basis of available water by 6-hour, 2-hour, and 24-hour time slots. The gardeners opened the gates to irrigate the quarters shown here. I've taken an example of water sharing in the district, depending on the Zoya district, as illustrated here. Quarter or District 1 received first 48 hours. Here it's Quarter A that was entitled to receive the water supply for 48 hours flowing from the river, and those who use it today, it's in fact the same system of rotation that has been in place since the 13th century. And to conclude, these orchards are public areas, popular public spaces for the inhabitants of Kazmin, especially those who live in the outskirts. We can learn several lessons of the case study of the development and on the subsoil, on the plain and the town, how the practice of slowing runoff and groundwater recharge has become a central leader for spatial organization and land development. Today we hear much said about initiatives such as sponge towns. It shows how a river basin, a whole plain, was organized and thought of as a sponge, but over and above that, how the system creates agri-food dependencies in a river basin, promoting cooperation between upstream and downstream at various scales. But I could perhaps conclude with the two photographs on the right, which, as I see it, constitute the most important message, showing the celebration of Punjab Bidar in Persian, 50th day of spring that marks the end of the irrigation seasons. The inhabitants emerge from their houses and organize a picnic in the orchards, which last all day. It's a local feast celebration. It's a public holiday in the town with all its rituals, family gatherings, socio-cultural practices in these orchards. And so it's a subtle link between the orchard, this irrigation system, its management, the inhabitants and local culture that constitute the secret of resistant persistence. There's another irrigation system that I didn't go into further, but this system resists, and it's this subtle link between local culture and all the orchards and water management systems that offered this possibility that creates the resilience of these orchards faced with all the issues, urban erosion, modernization, infrastructure systems, roads, energy systems that threaten these spaces around a town not far from Tehran. Thank you for your attention.
Good morning, everyone. Myself, Prakhar Vidyarthi. I am an assistant professor at Parul University, Vadodara, and also part-time research assistant in metrology of Indian water project under Dr. Sarah Keller at Erfurt University, Germany. In this project, a part of study was to document and map the possible relation between urban settlements during the Solanki period, which is between 10th and 13th century, and hydrology of that area. During this research work, I came to understand that water has always played a fundamental role in shaping the evolution of human civilization. From the earliest river valley settlements to modern metropolitan cities, the control and management of water have determined not only the survival of communities, but also their system of organization, governance, and spiritual life. When I heard about this conference, I decided to research the settlement in the arid climate of Western India and their connection with water. In arid regions such as Kutch in Western India, where rainfall is scarce and erratic, water assumes an even more critical role. Here, community develops sophisticated system of harvesting, storing, and managing water rooted in deep understanding of ecology and landscape. One of the most remarkable examples of such adaptation is Tera village, located in northwestern Kutch, around 90 kilometers from Bhuj. This village is located near seasonal Miti River. Despite its arid environment, Tera has sustained its traditional water system and architecture characteristics for centuries, earning recognition as a heritage village by the government of Gujarat. This research explores how the architecture and settlement morphology of Tera village are fundamentally shaped by hydrology and how this understanding remains relevant in the contemporary discourse of climate resilience and sustainability. The study situates Tera within the broader framework of traditional water wisdom and argues that its hydrological system exemplifies a sustainable integration of architecture, ecology, and community organization. The study adopts a qualitative approach combining fieldwork, topographical analysis, and literature review. The initial phase involved a comprehensive review of historical record, previous studies on Tera's water system, and settlement evolution. This was followed by a physical survey, including photographic documentation of lakes, embankment, filtration platform, step wells, and drainage channels. Particular attention was given to build form that mediates water, such as spouts, ghats, retaining wall, which reflects the fusion of architecture design with hydrological function. Furthermore, topographic mapping was conducted to trace the natural slope, drainage pattern of the terrain. This observation helped in understanding how the settlement morphology of Tera responds to its hydrological context. About historical background, the origin of Tera village was not precisely documented, but it is believed to have emerged as a settlement around 16th century, when it becomes a Jahagir, which means feudal estate, under the Jadeja Rajputs of Kutch. The village remained under their control until India's independence in 1947. Much of Tera's existing architecture fabrics dates from the post-1819 period following the devastating run of Kutch earthquake, which led to widespread reconstruction. Historically, Tera was a fortified settlement composed of two parts, the citadel and the residential village. Today, remnants of the fort wall survive on the north and western side, while the eastern and southern side have been absorbed in later urban expansion. Oral accounts mention that there were originally 5 gateways, though only 3 survive, one each on the western, northern, northeastern side. The citadel, which remains most of its defensive wall, houses the ruins of the structure damaged during earthquake. It includes a well on its eastern side, which historically drew water from the adjacent lake, demonstrating how even defensive architecture was integrated with hydrological system. During the survey, evidence of water spout embedded in fort wall, residence compound, and community space indicates a well-organized network for distribution and draining water. A subtle depression along the streets suggests that the roads themselves were designed as channels for runoff, showing a conscious design intent to merge urban form with the water flow. On northeastern side of Tera lies an interconnected system of 3 lakes, Chhatasar, Samarsar, and Chatarsar. Each lake has a distinct function based on water quality and use. Chhatasar Lake caters to domestic activities such as bathing and washing. Samarsar Lake is reserved exclusively for potable water and is used for drinking and cooking. Chatasar lakes serve agriculture and livestock needs and is also used for washing. These lakes are separated by earth mound and stone embankments, which which minimize the risk of contamination and manage overflow between the reservoir. The elevated mound surrounding Somerset Lake forms a natural barrier preventing runoff and impurity water from entering the drinking water reservoir. The lakes are also connected through raised filtration platform built on stone and earth. As water as water flows from one lake to another, it passes through this filtration bed where sedimentation naturally purifies it. This gravity-based system requires no mechanical intervention and is maintained through community participation. On the southeastern outskirts of the village stands a stepwell adjacent to Sitla Mata temple complex. Its location indicates it serves both ritual and practical purpose, providing water for temple ceremonies and for travelers or pilgrims who reside temporarily outside the fortified in ancient times. Uh, Topographical analysis. Topographic studies reveal that Tera village is strategically located on elevated terrain, a deliberate choice that minimizes flooding while facilitating gravity-driven water distribution. The settlement's design takes full advantage of natural slope to direct water flow into reservoir and drainage channel. A recently constructed check dam diverts excess monsoon runoff from the nearby Miti River towards the eastern side of the village. Traditionally, water from the river used to approach through a natural curve of river. This diverted water then flows into the lake in the sequence, first Chatasar, then to Samasar, and lastly to Chatasar lake, after which it again merged with the river. Within the village, streets are designed to function as rainwater passage, guiding runoff through carefully graded slope. I divided the settlement into two primary drainage zones. Western zone, which is in light green color, channels rainwaters towards the fort's western gate and a northern weak hole in the fort wall where it exists and eventually reconnects with the Mithi River. The eastern zone, which is in light red color, in contrast, direct runoff towards the lake system, beginning with Chatasar and continue through the filtration platform into Somerset Lake. Around the Chatasar Lake, three temples located on south, east, and west bank highlights the spiritual relation between water and architecture. These temples are associated with ritual bathing, and the ghats attached to them serve as a community gathering space. The continuous renovation of this temple and associate ghat through the practice of Jinnodharam, devotional maintenance, which is performed by both Hindu and Jain community, ensures the prevention of both sacred structure and the water body they adjoin. This symbolic maintenance system reflects the deep interconnection between faith, community, ecology in Tera. Learning from Tera's water wisdom. The study of Tera water structure reveals that water is not mere a resource. It is a design principle that shapes the organization of both space and society. Settlement exemplifies a territorial system where architecture, landscape, and community governance operate as a united ecology framework. Three fundamental principles emerge from this system: decentralization, integration, and community participation. First, decentralization ensures that multiple smaller bodies collectively sustain the settlement rather than relying on single source. This distribution enhances resilience against drought or structure failure. Second, the integration of built and natural systems such as street that doubles as water channel and temples that overlook lakes demonstrate how architectural design and hydrology can coexist harmoniously. Third, community participant, evident in the practice like Jinodharam and periodic distilling of lake, ensure that maintenance is embedded within a social and cultural routine, creating a sustainable model of water governance. From Tera's example, several lessons can be drawn for contemporary water management and urban planning. We must work with the landscape rather than against it, designing settlements that respond to natural topography, empowering local communities to take part in water governance, revive collective ownership and accountability. Finally, there is an urgent need to revalue traditional ecological knowledge not as relic of the past, but as active framework capable of informing modern climate adaptation strategies. In contemporary scenario, when the UNESCO World Water Development Report 2022 warned of groundwater depletion as an invisible crisis, Terra offers a valuable insight into sustainable and decentralized water management. Terra thus represents more than a heritage settlement. It is a model of territorial intelligence where the environment and human settlements co-evolve through mutual adaptation. By study and reinterpreting such traditional system, we not only preserve cultural memory but also rediscover path towards the ecologic balance and climate responsive design. Thank you all for listening, and at the end, my sincere thanks to the organizing committee of this conference, Learning from Desert, and for providing me this platform to share my research. Thank you.
Bonjour à tous.
Good morning to all. I will explain a survey that I carried out, in particular in a seminar called Bocage. Bocage is woodland and pasture. The bocage can take several forms and shapes, and we wondered what could happen in non-European countries where it would be a different type of bocage, and I looked in particular at Morocco, and in particular the Sousse Plain. A brief reminder for those of you who are not familiar with Morocco: you tend to think it's a tourist country, but in fact, it's still, it's first of all a mining country with 70% of the world reserves of phosphate. In other words, mining is very important for the economy in Morocco. And then in parallel, you have a population with fast growth, the demographic growth, and drought that has now been present for the last 10 years, and less rainfall. Why the Sousse Plain? Because I wanted to look at hydropolitics from that particular region, and it represents 35% of the farming or agricultural production in Morocco, but it doesn't cover 35% of the needs of the country. In fact, its production is for export. That comes from a long time ago when the French arrived in Morocco. What they did was to design Morocco as a wheat provider, and when France stopped importing, the wheat was not profitable any longer in Morocco, and that led to an agricultural crisis, and that's when Moroccans went to California to look at their agricultural production, and they decided to go for added value produce. And it was a new policy with a lot of irrigation for citrus fruit and vegetables and fruit to be exported to Europe. And then they had a new plan talking about 1 million hectares with irrigation. They wanted to build a few dams and use pumping of the underground water to provide for irrigation. And then Morocco became independent, which continued, and then the country continued this policy with 140 new dams built under the leadership of Hassan II. And in the 70s, it absorbed a lot of the state investments. About 40% of all state money was invested in dams, which was huge, to try to boost cash crops in Morocco. And that was to the detriment of rivers and small rivers, and it was a disaster for drought. In other words, it works in theory, but in practice, the farmers decided to choose high-yield crops. They forgot about the usual market gardening produce that they were used to. So that had a devastating impact, and in particular on biodiversity, because if you produce a lot of dams in a country, it damages the biodiversity. And then the problem of irrigation and evolution or transformation of crops was compounded by a plan of 2008 started by the Ministry of Agriculture that led to using drips to try to save water, but it had the same consequences. You think that you save water and you start having different crops that use up a lot of water, and in fact it was a disaster because these were not the adequate or the right crops for the area. So in the end, you see that hydropolitics led to something that led to what we call agrumiculture. It means orange trees and olive trees that are linked to drip irrigation. Then you have a new model called
à cet objet bocage qu'on étudiait dans le séminaire,
anti-bocage, that is
qu'on peut penser comme une sorte de prolongement
agriculture or
de
crops in greenhouses,
plus extrême. Elle est hors
which
sol, elle
is
n'utilise même pas le sol de la plaine,
not
cultive
in
sur un
the
substrat de culture à base de
ground,
fibres de coco.
using cocoa
déploie des
fibers,
techniques, on va dire,
coconut
architecturales, donc
fibers,
c'est pas vraiment de l'architecture,
with
pour contrôler
new
un climat,
techniques to try
puisque les
to
cultures
control the
qu'elle met en avant, c'est
climate,
principalement de la framboise,
because they
des
produce
fleurons,
essentially
des bananes,
raspberries,
des choses exotiques,
red
on va dire.
berries,
Et
bananas,
ensuite, il y a
and so forth.
l'agriculture,
And then you
vivrière,
have cash
on en a
crops,
beaucoup parlé ce matin, qui dépend plutôt
which
de petits canaux creusés dans le sol,
depends on small canals
qui est certes
dug in the soil to try to irrigate
plus d'eau, mais en fait, elle
the
permet la
fields.
recharge des nappes.
And that enables underground water to recharge.
Des céréales
It's for
desquelles vivent en fait ces agriculteurs.
barley and
Et en même temps, des
cereals,
légumineuses, des petits fruits,
or
des petits légumes,
pulses,
des
or
oliviers et
vegetables, olive
des
trees,
araignées.
and
Et donc, ces trois
argan
modèles
trees.
de la vallée,
These
si on les
three
spatialise,
models are in the
on a
valley,
l'impression,
and if you
comme ça,
put
qu'il y a
them on a map,
des
there
zones
you
un peu
are.
claires qui se dégagent,
You
et
have the
c'est
feeling there are
un peu
some
le cas ici,
light
à Lourdes,
green
où on voit, qu'il y
areas
a encore un petit foyer
where
de
there's
l'agriculture
still
vivrière. Il faut savoir qu'en fait, l'agriculture vivrière dont je viens de parler, elle prend des formes différentes. Elle suit la géographie dans laquelle elle s'implante.
Subsistence
Donc, si elle est
agriculture.
au bord d'une rivière, en fait, elle va détourner l'eau de la rivière.
But this subsistence agriculture tends to harness the water from the rivers or the springs, which is a problem. So here you see there are still some subsistence crops there. Here you have a lot of greenhouses. It's near the harbor and the roads. But it's very difficult to look at the different models. If you have a bird's eye view, you see that the farmers that tend to deal with subsistance agriculture go for single crops, and you have a mixture of crop production systems. Now, let's look at citrus fruit production. A satellite view shows this. The water systems are not shared any longer. It's each plot has its own water source with water tanks for 2 or 3 days of irrigation.
En fait, c'est un modèle qui dépend principalement
du
pompage de nappes.
Depends on pumping the underground water. Although in Morocco, there's a shortage of water every year.
C'est quand même le grand modèle aujourd'hui.
But it's the main model that's been
aspire à avoir. C'est le plus rentable. Et en parallèle, on voit
used.
Que c'est en fait ça qui permet à cette région d'être la plus
that's why the region is quite productive in market gardening today.
C'est aussi une forme de bocage qui est complètement différente.
And you have a different type of woodlands, different from Europe.
En fait, ça crée un bocage qui est purement fonctionnel.
This woodland is purely functional.
Bocage de cyprès et de philao qu'on voit ici.
You have cypress trees and philaos that are only there to protect
en fait, il a un usage très fonctionnel et utilitaire. Il protège les fruits,
the fruit-growing trees against the wind. So that's the only reason why they have these trees there.
Donc pour faire en fait ces études sur ces trois modèles, j'ai
rencontré But to look at the three models and discuss them, I met a number of farmers. This guy is retired and has an orange farm, orange growing farm, and he said that oranges
de plus en plus dur à cultiver
are harder and harder to grow because of the shortage of water, and now they're looking at.
Mais d'abord, je voudrais vous parler de l'infrastructure que déploie ce
And now they're producing prickly pears.
En fait, c'est une infrastructure très complexe, très coûteuse aussi, puisque
But it's quite complex in terms of water management. It's very expensive to pump water from the underground water lakes. It uses up a lot of water, and from an economic point of view, it is not profitable because you have to go further and further, deeper and deeper into the soil to pump water. And this is a cost that most farmers can't bear. And then you also need storage and regulation of inputs like
qui permet de les gérer directement dans l'eau en termes de quantité. Donc là, on voit une monoculture de figues de Barbarie, justement parce qu'il y a de moins en moins d'eau dans la plaine et que
because there's less and less water, and the prickly pears that vanished in Morocco some years ago, it's become very profitable. So it's very profitable to grow prickly pears like that. So the question is that proof of the market adapting to new conditions? But when the farmers are short of water, that's what happens to their farms, and the woodland is completely dried up, and farmers move somewhere else to look for another plot of land. And here, I'd like to ask a question that I was asked several times. What does an architect do in a field? What is his function? And when I carried out this particular survey, I realized that geologists looked at the situation and at massive pumping in this area, that it destabilized the soils and worsened or provoked the earthquake in 2023. Now, perhaps this should be taken with a pinch of salt, but it is interesting. The Lorca earthquake in Spain in 2018 was shown to have been provoked by human activities, and in particular the massive pumping of aquifers. So it has an architectural impact. You lose in architecture, houses, a way of living. It's a different way of growing crops, of producing food. All this disappears. And instead, we build new houses that do not fit into their environment. So the rural culture of the mountains disappears. to try to deal with an emergency. And on top of that, massive pumping of underground water threatens the plains and the villages that depend on small wells or small pumps or rivers with the surface water that are stopped by dams, and therefore the underground water becomes very saline, so the water is very much salted, and people depend on the water of the dams. Hence, competition for the use of water in order to provide for rapid growth. But everything dries up. So beyond this issue, it raises a lot of issues about the model, the production model adopted. And if you look at this particular village here, you see it's not a village any longer, but a small town in a sea of white plastic with different architectures, different buildings that are more of what we could call global urban planning. In other words, there's no separation between what is natural and built by human beings, and therefore, this is a model that will use all water springs or sources available.
Il pompe directement avec le système que je vous ai expliqué tout à l'heure.
And that is a problem because farmers will pump the underground water or get water from the dams, and there's competition between farmers, and that is for market gardening and early produce. And when you see fruit and vegetables and less than €1 in Carrefour in France, well, they come from Morocco. Here, this is a woman I met, but she was more of an agronomist working for a subsidiary of the American giant called Driscoll's. Here, they produce raspberries, and these are a few images to show you the system that they use: wooden structures, plastic cables, tarpaulins, and that is for a whole plain with white tarpaulins, transforming the landscape in the Sousse plain with an impact on the territories and the region. But this particular production model develops because the labor is cheap, and as Saskia Sassen says, in brutality and complexity in the global economy, this is the outcome of easy access to land, to water. Water is cheap because you can pump the underground water for very little, but it is the outcome of weakened government and the destruction of traditional economies that have been destroyed over decades or centuries. It started when the French arrived in Morocco, but then it was increased by the governments that took power after the independence. These traditional economies are a real problem, in particular for subsistence crops. Here, subsistence crops in the mountains. It's a place I was privileged enough to visit, and you see this man who sells fruit and vegetables in town, but he's also he lives in a village where he has subsistence crops. You have a spring, a small dam, canals that take the water to the plots of land. Each family has a plot and a certain volume of water with rules put in place by the community, the village community. It could be based on time or volumes, but this is for the vast majority of farms in Morocco. 70% of all farms are smaller than 5 hectares, and they grow olives, fava beans, pulses, cereals, essentially, and argan trees as well for the oil. Some pictures show you the system in place. You have these tiny dams on canals that are called seguia. And what is surprising and that raises questions about the earthquake, when I went to the villages, they told me that some springs had dried up, but started flowing again after the earthquake. So water is available again for some families that had been deprived of water in the past. Here, fava beans, peas, onions, and argan trees. In these villages, they tend to grow crops through associations of farmers where they tended to mix crops and complement each other, but that tends to disappear. The idea being that they need inputs in the soil to make them more fertile, with phosphate in particular. And here you see part of the valley which are not grown by lack of labor, because the young people moved to cities and the system is getting lost. You have no one to look after these seguia. And the problem is when these models stop being used, and if you add the fact that cities and suburbs lose in permeability, then you see that you end up with floods, flash floods that are deadly every year or every 2 years, and they become more intense. So the systems contributed to a stabilization of the soils and regions, and they contribute to the catastrophes that we see now. Hence the question, how should we learn again to inhabit our own regions or territories, because we will have more and more needs for water, and water is not available any longer, and there's competition for water. So the issue is, what sort of infrastructures do we need to solve the needs for water? This is Seguia and the Khbara that was mentioned yesterday. You have concrete Seguia. These are canals that bring water from the dam to the plots and the fields, and they were left alone. So you see large canals that have been abandoned. And then you have water reservoirs from underground water pumping. Desalinization is seen as a solution, but what sort of infrastructure that you need in order to use seawater and remove the salt? And the answer is no, it doesn't work. When I went there, the argan tree can create woods in the plain, but they're shared by the communities or the tribes. And we were told that one rainfall during the year is enough for argan trees to become profitable for farmers. So we could think about this particular plant. It's only available in Morocco, and we could have a high added value economy with argan trees. So instead of producing raspberries and compete with other countries like Spain, in order to leave the export markets, we could have just a crop that is endemic to Morocco, the argan tree, that only grows there, that has a lot of different outcomes, and that could provide for a proper landscape that would be very local whilst remaining in a global economy and not damaging the development of Morocco. Thank you very much.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Je vais aujourd'hui présenter les résultats de ma recherche sur le
Good morning. I wanted to quickly talk to you about the research that I've been doing into Persian gardens, tying in theoretical notions with very contemporary issues. I want to try and show you that when looking at landscaping, the urban environment, the current practices are not sustainable, and a lot of them have depleted a lot of resources and created very fragile natural environments. Because of that, we need to rethink our relationship with the earth, with land. We need to rethink our relationship, this domination-based approach to land. To focus something to focus more on something which is reciprocal, a to and fro between man and nature. And when we look at Persian gardens, we can really find something quite interesting in them because it's this constant search for symbiosis. And it is something which has been very present throughout many non-Western traditions. And Iranian gardens are one of those many traditions. Persian gardens can provide a really interesting space for us to rethink the way we inhabit the world, to come up with something much more sustainable. For this research, I looked at mesology, as Augustin Berg defined it, and I would like to talk about three key relationships. We have analogical, enrichment, complementarity. I will try and present these different types of relations to you, and then after that I will show you just how these different relationships can open up new perspectives to think the issues that we're facing today. First type of relationship that we identified is this one, analogy. When looking at the analogy between different beings, and we can see buildings, values, the central plateau in Iran, and how the garden reflects that. And we can see this in the picture on the left. The landscape of this region is made up predominantly of mountain ranges. In between those mountain ranges, we find quite luxurious valleys. These are very special places in the valleys where you find rivers flowing through them. You find quite abundant vegetation. It's a more temperate, much more humid climate. Now, if you look at the Persian garden, the second depiction, this is the Dalatabad garden. It's closed off by shapes. So, like the mountain ranges close off the valley, here in the Persian garden you find walls which close off the garden from the surrounding space, allowing humidity to remain inside that space. And just like you have a river going through the center of the valley, in the Persian garden you have a central canal, a water channel, which shapes space, but it also provides cool air for the surrounding vegetation. And it's an interesting similarity, and this shows that the Iranian people had always drawn from the local environment. The Persian people had long lived in these valleys. They knew the dynamics that were at play within these valleys. They learned from that, and because of that they were able to leave the valley spaces, shift their communities out into the plains by copying what they learned from the valley onto the built environment in the plains. The Persian garden, it's not just the product of that analogical thought. It is the expression of a very interesting representation of nature, the symbolic aspect of nature. And we can see in the myths, the narratives, the beliefs of the Iranian people, the importance of nature. When natural elements are transformed into natural powers, the very power of nature is shown through this. They are not shown as divinities, but nature is conveyed more as morals and values of society. Here, for example, the earth is seen as espanta armaiti, which is divine knowledge used for key works. It's a way of completing certain tasks. It's a form of providing prosperity, abundance. It is the spenta armaiti which provides food and wealth. So this is where nature combines symbols, an association where nature is seen as a life source, and a link between the material and immaterial spaces. It's a source of life, it is the source of existence. for the Iranian people.
The
other relationship that we identified is that of enrichment, of providing wealth and prosperity. Now we need to understand that this is in an arid, semi-arid environment in the Iranian regions. And in that space, we have to create green spaces. To do so, you have to utilize considerable techniques and knowledge and expertise. And while the Persian garden is more a continuation of its own environment, it still requires some man-made structures. And in all of those techniques, one that I would like to focus on is irrigation and water distribution. This is what we saw in one of the previous presentations. It's the notion of kanat. It's a creation of underground galleries and tunnels and channels to tap into the water table and take that and channel that water towards villages and settlements. But these galleries are extended underground as much as possible, as close to villages as possible. So that's a way of reducing evaporation, which is quite considerable in the local region. And it is also for that reason that you can see the straight lines of canals. And the straight line is there to reduce the length of the distance that water needs to travel. And when you look at Persian gardens, you can see the geometry, and it's for these technical reasons that we have that geometry in place. It also ties back to the environment, so it's not just for symbolic purposes, it's for very practical reasons. Also in Persian gardens, what we can see is that the shape is governed by how available water is during the dry season. So it's not the original project which says how water is to be used, it's more the scarcity of water which determines what sort of a structure you're going to have and the extent of what sort of landscaping you can have. So that's why it's this harmonious relationship, which is why Persian gardens have been able to survive the ages. The Persian garden, it's also something which ties back to the thoughts of the ancient Persian civilization, who cultivated land. And they saw cultivating land not just as an economic practice, but it was a moral commitment, a spiritual commitment to the land. So cultivating the land, irrigating the land, making the land fertile, it was seen as a way of individuals to make the land happy, to pay tribute to celestial beings, to again create more abundance, more prosperity during your life on earth, preparing you for the life after. Mankind has to embody the same qualities, and to do so you have to make the land around you prosper. And that is why when we look at the ancient Iranian or ancient Persian civilizations, agriculture, farming is seen as a religious act. And this is what we can see in the spandarmatiki, which is a way of being in relation with the land. The third type of relationship I want to talk to you is the complementarity between a garden and its surrounding environment. It is a space where there is an interdependent relationship. This complementarity is seen predominantly through the way one experiences the garden from a physical point of view. And what we can see in these pictures is the surrounding landscape in this region is coloured in ochres and browns, whereas the garden is quite different. It's quite green. It is in stark contrast, because here you have a green oasis in the middle of a desert. But the Persian garden is really marked by that greenery. It's a microclimate, it's quite temperate, it's quite moist and damp.
pense que aussi le
inside
jardin
the garden
persan
walls.
apparaissent comme un paradis, c'est un lieu de repos, de rafraîchissement.
They are seen as a safe haven, a place
répond en fait à un
to
besoin
seek
essentiel
cool
de peuple iranien
and
disposer
calm.
d'un lieu de
So the
rafraîchissement,
Iranian garden, the Persian
repos
garden,
et de
is a place of
protection
rest, a
dans
place
un
of protection
environnement,
in a harsh,
contraignant.
quite hostile environment.
Et cette complémentarité aussi est d'ordre symbolique.
But in addition to the practical complementarity, you also have symbolic complementarity. When we look back at ancient Persian gardens, they were seen as quite sacred spaces.
Cette image se construit en fait en contrepartie avec le monde
But it was a way of again comparing the inside and the outside world. You had the sacred world inside and the non-sacred world outside, quite a wild space outside where evil beings roamed. So the Persian garden comes into its full meaning when you look at this complementarity between the inside and the outside. I think these three different types of relationships, analogy, enrichment, complementarity, these are three ways through which the Persian garden and the surrounding environment are connected. It also shows a view of the world where things exist in hand-to-hand. They co-create. If I were to quote Augustin Gabert once again, it's a way where things are not linear. It's not a space where one causes another. It is a space where things interact. The Persian garden, it shapes the world, but it is also in response to the world around it. It is a constant exchange between the in and the out, constantly adjusting, constantly responding to the different realities. Again, with the reality of the climate, seismic movements, tectonic movements, it's also in response to the knowledge and the expertise that people have, but it's also in relation to the cosmic beliefs that people have. So we see the interaction between these different spaces. And what we see today is that there's a deep need to go beyond this view where man is not part of its environment. We need to move beyond that. Predominantly because man is the origin of a lot of crises that we are currently facing. So we need now to go back to a space where we can put mankind back in a different space within the world, within the universe, as being in relationship with the environment. And that's why we can come back to these three key relationships that I spoke here today. Analogy, we have to think of a way of building, one where we can be in sync with the environment around us, one which the environment around us lets us or lets us not do. It's a way of communicating with it, building our ideas upon balance, upon a measured response, finding a nice balance rather than constantly growing and developing. We need to be more mindful of how fragile the environments are, and that's what enrichment is about. And for complementarity, we need to focus on not just having beings and spaces as autonomous and individual. We need to see them more as an interrelational existence, an interdependent existence between beings and their environment. So when we look at Persian gardens, this is a lived-in space which leads us to another form of ontology, where we look at mankind and land in a different way. Thank you very much.